Welcome to Out of the Fold. My guest today is Izzy Posen. He grew up in an ultra-Orthodox Jewish community in the UK, and now considers himself a Jewish atheist. I accidentally suggested describing him as ex-Jewish when we were discussing how to write his current belief system or lack thereof, and he rightfully let me know that he would not consider himself an ex-Jew. Izzy details more about what being both Jewish and an atheist mean to him in this episode. No religious organizations, companies, or individuals were contacted for comments about any of the content of this episode. The views expressed are strictly those of the ones expressing them. Our conversation began on a Tuesday evening.
My name is Izzy Posen. I am a physics and philosophy student at the University of Bristol in the west of England. I'm really passionate about it, and I love just thinking about all these thought experiments and what they tell us about human knowledge and nature, and an especially interesting area for me, which is quite relevant to the things we'll probably be discussing, is skepticism. I'm quite interested in kind of the limits of knowledge and the levels of certainty we should give to our own opinions, and that's obviously very relevant to religion.
Definitely.
Mm.
So what do you believe now? How would you describe what you believe now religiously?
So, in terms of the God question, I'm an atheist. I don't think there is a God out there. In terms of wider religious questions, like morality and meaning, I think so. So the way I like to think about meaning is I like to see it in a culturally contextual way. So I think humanity has existed for a long time, and over this time, they've kind of experimented with different ways of finding meaning. And I think there is meaning to be found in all kinds of traditions. And so for example, people might be surprised to hear that despite me being an atheist and not believing in God, I still describe myself as Jewish, and Judaism is quite an important identity to me. And we can talk more in detail about that, but for now, I see importance in Jewish teachings, not in a sense that they guide me morally, or that I think that's a source of knowledge when I don't have any knowledge from elsewhere. So I don't think it's like a divine source that can give me knowledge that I don't discover in other places. But I think since it's this human experiment that's been going on for thousands of years, there are findings there that people have found over the years of meaning and of experiments with ways to frame society, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So again, in terms of believing in God, I don't believe in God. But in terms of cultural aspects and meaning, I think that for some people, a religion can provide them with meaning and grounding in life.
I get that. And actually, I heard a term recently that might relate to that. I heard somebody talking about the fact that there are these, specifically, I think they said that Thomas Jefferson was like a Christian atheist, where like he kind of took apart a Bible because he liked what Jesus said, but he couldn't have cared less about the supernatural stuff. Right. So it was about the morals of what Jesus said, but as far as going to hell or going to heaven or all the miracles, that all didn't matter to him whatsoever. Is that sort of what you're saying in the context of Judaism, or is it less about morals and more something cultural and maybe, in the political things that it tried to do and say?
Yeah, so I think there's a big difference between the New Testament and the Old Testament. So Jews, their religious book is the Old Testament and not the New Testament. I
Right.
think that the New Testament would be, it was written later in time. I think it would be more closely aligned, although not perfectly, but it would be closer aligned to modern secular morality. So meaning, of course, it wouldn't be perfect, but someone like Thomas Jefferson would be able to look into it and find things. He would say, oh, I like empathy, I like compassion, I like tolerance, I can take those. With the Old Testament, it's a little more tricky. The Old Testament was written slightly earlier in time, in a different context. So the teachings there are less similar to modern secular sentiments.
Hmm.
It's more occupied with, ritual slaughter, what animals you can eat, forbidden sex acts, and it's very legalistic. So I wouldn't say it's so much the moral aspects that I see myself taking from it. It's more a grounding of my own heritage, of where I come from. So we don't think of ourselves as people um, just in a vacuum. We come from somewhere. We come from a history, and even if we can look back and see people having made mistakes in history, they're still our heritage that we've learned from them and we've grown based on that. So I just think it's in terms of grounding, in terms of culture. That's where I come from. That's the kind of things they believe. I may no longer believe in them, but that's still my history. I don't know if that makes sense.
Can you give an example of how that might be not necessarily just acknowledging your heritage, but is also, still somehow, or is it more so that it's not a religion to you? It is just sort of something that you don't want to separate from your lack of belief in God.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's a religion for me. I would say it's a cultural grounding, cultural context. So I'll give you an example. The Sabbath, right? So an important commandment in Judaism, and it's one of the Ten Commandments, is resting on the Sabbath.
Hmm.
And it's very interesting. In the Torah, in the Bible itself, it gives two reasons in two different books. In one is in Deuteronomy and one is in Numbers. In one book, it gives the reason you should rest on the seventh day because that's when God rested and He created the world and He rested on the seventh day, and to remember that you should rest. The other reason is given to because you should rest because you deserve a break, and give your slaves a break and give your animals a break. And I think, of course, the first one, it's very difficult for me to connect with because I don't believe that God created the world. The second one, it's a humanistic idea, give yourself a break, let everyone in your household rest. I mean, take away the idea of slaves, which is not so humanistic, but given the context that they have slaves working for them, they have animals, the idea, okay, take a day off, rest. It's an idea I can relate to. So I wouldn't say I would rest because the Bible says to rest. I would just say that if I anyway rest, which in our society it's anyway normal to take a day off,
Hmm.
I would say that it adds cultural meaning if I can take some of the rituals associated with the Sabbath, the day of rest, and I can apply it to my days. For example, in Jewish tradition, traditionally you light candles on the Sabbath, and sometimes when I feel like it, I do it as well. It's because it's my resting day. I'm resting, and it just adds some meaning to do this kind of ritual.
I get that, and I think I told you that my wife is a non-practicing Jewish, and we'll light yahrzeit candles when somebody dies. There is just something about it. You're right. I mean, it's like it doesn't matter that you're not doing it because of a specific doctrine or like for God. There is just something about it that feels right to do. Something about the personal ritual of doing that.
It's very interesting. I had a conversation once with a liberal rabbi. So these liberal rabbis, they're not necessarily believers in all the tenets of the faith. Some of them are even outright atheists. So I had a conversation once with this liberal rabbi about the ritual of saying Kaddish. Have you heard of this ritual?
I
Uh,
haven't. No.
right. So after a person dies, and also on a yahrzeit, on the day of and the anniversary of the death, there's a prayer called the Kaddish that religious Jews tend to recite. And it's in a language, it's an ancient Aramaic, the language that the Jewish community spoke around between 1,500 and 2,000 years ago, when they were living in modern day Iraq, then Babylonia. And it's a prayer about how God should be exalted. It's literally the whole prayer from beginning to end is just praying that God's name should be exalted in the world. And it's interesting that even liberal and sometimes secular Jews say this prayer in Aramaic, when celebrating the death of a loved one or commemorating the death of a loved one. And I was asking this liberal rabbi, I mean, you don't believe in this. And also, it doesn't seem appropriate that when commemorating someone's death, you suddenly go to exalting God. This seems out of context. Why are we still doing this? And he said that's exactly the idea, that it's in Aramaic, it's in a language that none of the congregants understands, and they have no clue what they're saying. That very thing makes it so ritualistically meaningful. It's like a mantra that you're saying. It's devoid of meaning because nobody understands what you're saying. So it's absolutely not about exalting God as the original Aramaic is. It's just about saying a string of words that nobody knows what it means, but it's a ritual.
And it's probably also got something to do with the fact that they know that there is some meaning to it. You know, like if they knew that the words were just nonsense, or like, you know, they were the Aramaic translation of Little Red Riding Hood or something like that doesn't really mean much. But even if you do sort of associate it with something supernatural, might sound kind of condescending, but I don't mean it to be. It's like just knowing that it is associated with something like that it does give it meaning, even if you don't believe what it's for.
I don't know. I would think, knowing the kind of people who say these pray, I would think they would be horrified if they actually knew it's all about exalting God's name. Because often,
Really?
often when you're mourning someone, the last thing you want to do is exalt God's name. If you do believe in God, you're often angry at God. I mean, you just lost a loved one. I think I think people maybe think that it's about death, or something meaningful in that direction, but because they don't know the translation, it's somehow meaningful. I don't know.
Hmm.
I mean, I who do know the translation, because I've studied these things for years in rabbinical school, and we can come back to talk about that. I would personally feel very uncomfortable saying a prayer like that.
I guess that makes sense. It's like when somebody's taken away from you, it's like the last thing you want to do is pray and do something to positively view the person or the entity that you believe took that person from you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot more sense now that I think about it like that.
Yeah, there's another important thing, about, specifically Judaism and atheism. Why I think generally I think that atheism can go together with a lot of cultural context, and I think there's a trend emerging now of Christian atheism. I've heard a couple of people refer to themselves as Christian atheists
Hmm.
due to the culture they get from Christianity, or even moral lessons or something like that. But I think specifically with regards to Judaism, and this is something many people don't know, Judaism started long before the Jewish religion started. So Jews, as we know from archaeology now, Jews, I mean, they didn't call themselves Jews, of course, they were proto-Israelites. Um, they were living in the area now, you know, uh, Palestine, Israel, that kind of area. They were living there for centuries before any of the biblical texts were ever written or ever even transmitted. They were living as heathens and pagans, worshiping all kinds of local Canaanite gods, so from the tribes around them, and they developed a unique identity, a kind of proto-Jewish identity with customs and rituals long before the Jewish religion became canonized, long before the Ten Commandments got written down. And there's evidence in the biblical literature as well, because in the books of all the stories of the kings and prophets, the writer keeps on telling how the Israelites were worshipping idols, and the prophet didn't like it, and God punished them, and so on.
Hmm.
And this goes on for centuries and centuries. And the kings, the heroes of Israel, the kings are also described as worshipping idols, right? Now, of
Hmm.
course, the biblical writer puts it in the context of they were disobeying God. But what we know now from archaeology and from a critical analysis of biblical texts is that actually that was the earlier custom, to just worship a whole plethora of gods. There was no centralized religion. And it was only later, in the later biblical stage, when some prophets or kings came about and decided to kind of canonize Judaism as a monotheistic religion. And then they came up with all these legalistic commandments. So for me, as an atheist, I go back to, so to speak, my ethnic origins, and I see there's so much Jewish culture and Jewish beginning before religion came along. So there's definitely it's definitely not the case that, you're an atheist, there is no place for you in Judaism because, well, there was place for all these pagan kings and pagan prophets. So, but before it became monotheistic. So why shouldn't there be place for Jewish atheists?
Do you do anything personally that's maybe associated not necessarily with Judaism of like, let's say, I don't know if like Moses forward would be the right term for what you're referring to as far as the Jews that were polytheistic. But what do you do personally anything that's sort of in remembrance or ritual that that was associated with the polytheistic Jews?
Yes, so we actually have so the Jewish festivals practiced in modern days. We know that they were practiced in ancient variants, kind of differently back then. I wouldn't say I necessarily practice them, but it's not important enough for me to go out of my way to practice them in, so to speak, an authentic way. But I am conscious of the fact that the kind of festivals celebrated today by modern Jews are ancient festivals, and in modern Judaism they're very much about gods. For example, the festival of Passover is about how God took out the Jews from Egypt and released them from slavery. Now, I don't think that story ever happened. There's lots of historical evidence to suggest that actually the Israelites never left Israel, Palestine. They were never in Egypt to begin with. But it's interesting that in earlier biblical sources that we can isolate through modern linguistic methods, we know that actually the festival of Passover was a agricultural festival related to I think it's not the cutting, it's the is it the cutting? It may be the reaping of wheat. So it's an agricultural festival that the story of the Exodus from Egypt was added much later. So it's just that I wouldn't, again, I'm not saying I devote a lot of time to practicing these festivals in this way. It's not up there super important identity for me, but I'm conscious of these things. And if I do tend to, celebrate the Jewish festival and maybe, make a little dinner for my friends and I'll be conscious of that fact.
Well, when you're talking about agriculture and something like that, I mean, it's a positive thing. It's like, regardless of whether you're doing it for God or not, I mean, the idea, and especially when you're talking about in this context where many of the pagan gods were based off of nature, or what they saw and experienced around them. I mean, in this case, it's like, yeah, I mean, this is something that you're doing that's actually going to benefit the earth.
Right. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly how. I mean, it's important not to, and I'm not saying you're saying that, but sometimes we can be a little anachronistic and overly glorify paganism as if that's, eco-friendly kind of religion. It also came with its with its own host of superstitions.
No,
and
definitely.
the occasional human sacrifice and so on. So it's definitely not something to go back and glorify. But it definitely was more. I mean, compared to, it's definitely less abstract. So monotheism tends to be not based in reality at all. So it's about a man in the sky whom you never see. It's about a heaven and hell after you die. So you never see it in your lifetime. Whereas pagan religions tend to be based in reality, albeit a mistaken view of reality, a pre-scientific view of reality. But at least it's based on things you can tap and you can touch and smell and see.
I think that's what I mean. Yeah, I don't in any way mean to glorify them. And you're right. Like, I was actually just thinking about that today. Like, for whatever reason, this is just my brain. I was thinking about the Vikings today. And like, right. I was thinking about like how much we in our kind of modern society, we have to some degree glorified, Viking gods, like, especially if you look at the movie Thor or like the show Vikings or anything like that. It's like, we're saying that this is great, but like human sacrifice and disease and sexual assault and things like that were rampant when these things were going on. And there's really, like, yes, you're right, there are absolutely things that you can take from it, but there's not really that much more value to the mystic side of it than there is to most other fundamental versions of any religion.
Yeah. I think also monotheism arose at the right time. So it was, the pagan polytheistic worldview wouldn't stand up long to any kind of advance in science. That means the second you discover that that there are other causes to reign other than bowing to a god, to a statue, it would cause a disconnect between what you believe and reality. Whereas I feel monotheistic religions, what they did is they pushed the divine further away into the abstract. So it's no longer about, if you look in the Old Testament, for example, it's the reward and punishment is not in heaven and hell. It's all in this world. If you're wicked, your crops will just fail. That's
Right.
just how it is. If you're good, your crops will be blessed. And, but I guess as our scientific understanding advanced, in order to keep believing, in order to keep our theistic world, where we had to push these things to the afterlife, we had to push God further away. God cannot be, just a superhuman, because we now have more access to the world and we can't find him. Okay, so he's in the clouds, right? When we reach the clouds, we'll say he's invisible. So I feel like monotheism is just a response to scientific advance, pushing the mystical more in the abstract.
I get that. And do you think that that when the Jews became monotheistic, do you think that was that the God that they exalted was one of the polytheistic gods, or do you think it was just a whole new God?
No, it's very clear that Yahweh, or Jehovah, however you want to pronounce it, he was one of the gods worshipped by the Israelites. A long time before he became the god. But what happened when they became monotheistic is that worship of all other gods were banned. And it's interesting that, from what I understand, I'm not a biblical scholar expert by any means, but I've done some readings in my journey away from my faith. And from what I understand, in the early stages of Jewish monotheism, it wasn't even the case that they said Jehovah was the only God. It was just a matter of he's the only God we're allowed to worship. Because the other gods, yes, they're powerful, but Jehovah is more powerful. And Jehovah gets angry if you worship others, so just worship him.
It gives a whole new meaning to the "thou shalt have no other gods before me" thing. I think I was sort of raised to believe that meant that you just in general that you don't worship any other gods. But if it was in the context of the time, then it's saying there are people who believe other gods that are all around you, and you can't do that.
Right, it's very clear. If you know this historical knowledge, then a lot of biblical texts take on a very different meaning. There's a verse in Psalms that says, it's the prophet or the writer praising God. He says, "Who is like you amongst God, Yahweh? Amongst gods, Yahweh." Right? So amongst all the gods, who is like you? Who is as strong as you? So it always struck me as odd when I was still believing that Yahweh was the only God. It was like, what do you mean, who amongst the gods is like you? There are no other gods. And we would reinterpret that verse as saying, not who amongst the gods, but who amongst the powerful. So who amongst the powerful is like you, God, right? And it was, according to this interpretation, it was referring to powerful people. But when you read the verse in its literal meaning, it says, who amongst the gods is like you?
You're right. That completely changes the meaning of it. You're right. So were you raised into like an Orthodox version of Judaism?
Yeah, but not just any Orthodox, ultra Orthodox. So there's as with every religious group, there are lots of subdivisions and how seriously you take various parts. So Orthodox Judaism in general is just a brand of Judaism that follows religious law and religious dogma. So they believe in so-called 13 tenets of faith. Usually, amongst them, that God exists, that He will reward and punish you, that the Messiah is going to come, and so on. And they follow Jewish law. So laws like kosher food, laws like keeping the Sabbath, and other laws like that. Now, within this group is a group called ultra-Orthodox Jews. So they are a group that evolved in mid-18th century as a response to the Jewish Enlightenment that was going on then. So the Jewish Enlightenment was part of the General Enlightenment. It started in Germany and spread throughout Central Europe. where lots of Jews were being emancipated, and they started mingling with their non-Jewish friends, and many of them converted to Christianity nominally. But there were many, Jewish secularists who converted to Christianity just to fit in. There's one famous one is the German poet Moses Hess, or Hesse. I'm not sure how you pronounce it. He was a Jew, a secularist, but he converted to Christianity. Oh, Felix Mendelssohn is one of them as well. Karl Marx was one such Jew whose family were, atheists, but they converted to Christianity to fit in. So as a response to that trend happening, some Orthodox Jews said it's not enough just to be Orthodox. We also need to kind of isolate ourselves from the bad influences of secularism that's happening in the rest of society. So they started a very austere kind of worldview that started seeing the world in terms of good versus bad, us versus them, where I guess, when you feel under threat, you develop kind of an isolationist and an inwards-looking perspective. Mm-hmm. So, and that's the origins of ultra-Orthodox Judaism. Now, what it means in modern days is ultra-Orthodox Jews would generally not have, the regular means of access to the secular world. So, for example, they refrain from using media. They don't watch TV. They don't listen to the radio. In many cases, they ban access to the internet. They usually associate only amongst themselves. So they wouldn't go to university. They would only be educated in their own schools. They would refrain from mingling with non-ultra-Orthodox Jews. They're also distinctive in their dress. So men would wear black hats, beards, in some cases side locks. Women would dress very modestly with skirts and stockings, and married women cover their hair. So that's ultra-Orthodoxy, and I was raised in that community.
So you had to be were you completely separated from people who did not believe what you believed then for most of your childhood?
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in the Stamford Hill community of East London. It's a very large. It's the biggest ultra-Orthodox community in Europe. They have, I think, something like 30,000 or 40,000 members. And we were so isolated that we didn't even speak English, just to make sure that we don't mingle with the rest of society. So we had our own language, Yiddish, which was, for me, it was the only language until I was 18. And that's what we spoke in. And yeah, we wouldn't talk with outsiders, even Jews. We wouldn't talk with if they weren't ultra Orthodox.
Were you able to tell who was ultra Orthodox just by how they were dressing and how they carried themselves, or was there like another way that you did that? Because I mean, how would you know if somebody was definitely ultra Orthodox or just Orthodox or just Jewish, and whether or not you'd be able to associate with them?
Yeah, dress is a big one. So ultra-Orthodox Jews have their own code of dress, right, and regular Orthodox Jews don't. Language is a barrier, as I said. Yiddish is almost exclusively spoken not even by all ultra-Orthodox Jews, by a subset of ultra-Orthodox Jews called Hasidic Jews. Mm-hmm. And it gets a little bit confusing, the distinctions. But Hasidic Judaism is just a subgroup of ultra-Orthodox Judaism. So that would be a big distinguishing factor if they speak Yiddish or not. And also, because it's such a tight-knit community, so firstly, they live in physically semi-isolated areas. So they tend to live in the same areas as other ultra-Orthodox Jews. Also, remember, it's a community where men go 3 times a day to the synagogue, and women go once a week to the synagogue. And you go to the same schools, and you use the same shops, which are owned by ultra-Orthodox Jews. So it's a community in which pretty much everyone either knows each other directly or knows someone's brother or someone's relative and knows the family name. It's a community where people know each other. They know about each other. They recognize each other. So if you're an outsider, you can't really blend in.
How was the education system? You said that a lot of people are you said they're homeschooled a lot too?
Not homeschooled. So they have their own education system.
Okay, so that's what it was. Sorry.
Yeah, they have their own schools. Now, the generally the ideology in the community is boys need to spend all day long studying the Torah, religious law. Girls need to be brought up to be good Jewish mothers and housewives. Now, boys, because they need to spend the whole day studying Torah, they don't have time to engage in any secular education. There's a concept called bitul Torah, which means wasting time from studying Torah. So if you have 5 minutes in your day, which you can either use to study, your religious Jewish studies, or you can use to study maths or English, and you go and use it to study maths, then you're wasting your time because you could have studied God's law in that time. So therefore, there is no time in a boys. I'll come to girl why it's different with girls in a sec. But with boys, there's no time to study anything other than religious law. So we spent all day long in school, as other kids do, but we exclusively studied religious law, which includes the Hebrew Bible, the Talmud, Jewish law, Jewish ethics. That was it. Now, why it's different with girls is girls are not considered fit to study God's law. God's law is for men who have the capacities to understand it and connect with it. Women don't have the obligation to study God's law, and not only that, some Hasidic groups think that women are forbidden from studying Torah. So women don't do that. Instead, women do get some basic secular education. And the idea is that when they're marrying and their husbands will be busy studying God's law, they can help out by doing, the basic things like going to the bank and doing the shopping. So they can know a basic English and so on.
Is that scriptural, that view of women?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely. So there's maybe some clarification. So in Jewish theology, it has almost nothing to do with scripture. This may sound odd to Christians or ex-Christians, and especially, I guess, Protestants, sola scriptura, that idea that it comes from scripture. The Jewish religion, modern Jewish religion anyway, is based on the Talmud, not the Bible. Mm-hmm. The Talmud is an extensive multi-volume work which was compiled, I think it was in 700 AD, maybe a little earlier. But it documents discussions the rabbis have been having for a couple of centuries in the early centuries of the Common Era. Now, some call it a commentary on the Bible. It's not really. So it's Jewish law, which the rabbis develop, but often they will justify their rulings with scriptural verses. Now, these justifications are by no means literal. That means if you were to read this verse and you were to read the rabbi's ruling based on the verse, you would see no connection whatsoever. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes, rabbis would even give mystical reasons. So they would say, in this verse, there is an extra comma or an extra connective, an extra and. That means that you have to do X, Y, and Z, and they can deduce a whole volume of laws based on a word like that. Now, it's definitely not the case that it's an interpretation of the Bible. It by no means is, but it is the basis of modern Jewish law. How did I get here?
You're talking about the Talmud and how it
right.
is
It was scriptural to treat women that way. No, it isn't. It isn't scriptural. But the idea that men are obligated to learn religious law and women aren't is in the Talmud.
Huh. It's fascinating to me as I've been doing this show more to hear the connections between different things. Are you familiar with the Jehovah's Witnesses by any chance?
Not much. I've heard of them, and they've knocked on my door a couple of times. But
So I've interviewed a couple of Jehovah's Witnesses now, and there's one thing that this sounds like to me, and it's different in nature, but just in the way that they decided this. Jehovah's Witnesses don't celebrate birthdays. And the reason that a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses give is because there were only a few birthdays that were celebrated in the Bible, and at each of those birthdays, somebody died. So what they read into that was that God doesn't want us to celebrate birthdays. So you're saying that there are some verses where, if there's an extra comma, they think that it means this, and this is what these rabbis have decided or have debated and sort of concluded that that's what it means.
Yeah.
It sounds very similar to me, where you're either reading into it extensively, or you have a view, and in my mind, you could just be using scripture to justify what your view is, and you're going to do anything to do that.
Absolutely. And actually, I've been interested in these questions a lot since I left my faith, because when I was in the faith, I, of course, believe that when the rabbis say that the verse means something, then even if it doesn't seem that it means that to me, they knew better, right? And that extra word really does mean what they say it means. Now I have a different interest in it. Now I want to ask, okay, were these rabbis deceiving their followers? Were they making stuff up and deceiving people?
Mm-hmm.
Or were they self-delusional? Were they themselves deceiving themselves and really thinking this was what the verse meant? Or maybe a third option. Maybe they knew that that's not what the verse meant. Maybe there was some way of thinking that said, look, this is our practice, and as long as we can say that this is what the text means, that's enough, even if it doesn't really mean it. I'm not sure, but it's a very interesting question for me.
Yeah, and I think about it a lot, honestly. Whenever I'm thinking about religion, I mean, you're right. Like there are so many different options. It could not be evil in nature, and good and evil is such like obviously it's black and white. That's really not what I'm trying to do with that either. I think a lot of life is just shades of gray. So I mean, I don't want to say that this is just good or evil, right or wrong with what these guys are doing. But you're right. I mean, there's definitely the option in there that eventually you do something long enough that you just don't want to. You delude yourself into thinking that this is the way things are supposed to be, or you are just trying to do something so that you can create kind of teams of men versus teams of women, or whatever it is. Like I have no idea what it is or where it comes from, but I guess what's most fascinating to me is that it's still carried out in some places today, despite what we know.
Yeah. There's some quite sophisticated methods of explaining these that I've seen some rabbis develop. I haven't been convinced by any of them, but there's a school of thought that says something like this, that Jewish law is viewed like a legal system which has some rules that you have to follow. Now, the rabbis, according to this theory, they wanted to develop a legal system, and they were tied to the framework that told them something on the lines of, if you can find a way to make the biblical verse align with your view, then you have the right to make up your legal construct. So according to this view, they were well aware that the biblical verse doesn't mean what they were saying, but the legal framework told them that they have to find a way to put it into the biblical text. Yeah.
So the faith evolved from political need in a way.
Yeah, according to this view.
According to that view, right.
Yeah, you view kind of Jewish law as just like regular man-made law. It is man-made law. It just gets legal and religious force when rabbis manage to fit it into the biblical framework. But it's still human-created.
Yeah. How did you end up getting educated if you were raised into something where you were discouraged from educating yourself on anything but Jewish law?
So I was always curious, just naturally curious, looking around me and asking questions. So in my early childhood years, of course, I didn't have access to any science books, anything like that. I couldn't even read English. So I would just do my own thinking and observations, the way kids ask, why is the sky blue and where do we come from? These kinds of things. And I would just sit and think for myself. Mm-hmm. Eventually, over the years, I got hold of fringe books that gave me more and more light on things. So, for example, I discovered a book in my religious college library that was written by an 18th century rabbi who was Orthodox. But he was very excited by the recent discoveries about gravitation and about the early developments of electricity and so on. And he wrote a book in Hebrew for his congregation members, telling them about the new discoveries in science. And he, for his own reasons, he thought it pointed to the glory of God and so on. I discovered this book and I found that, oh, wow, this is a place that talks about science. So I read a lot in it. Of course, it was 18th century science, so it was hugely outdated. But even that, what we knew in the 18th century was enough to make me go back to some Talmudic passages, which, the Talmud is an extensive work. They cover not only legal matters, there's lots of stories about rabbis and lessons of life. It's really is a all-encompassing work. Mm-hmm. So I discovered some passages where they talk about science, and it just didn't align with the things that I read in that book. So I started reading more on this, and I discovered more of these kinds of books that they were fringe books. They were still within the Orthodox canon because they were written by Orthodox rabbis, but they were not meant to be read by us because they were deviating from our purpose because they were talking about science. So you may have you heard of Maimonides?
It rings a bell, but I don't want to say definitely yes because it's probably something different from what I think.
So Maimonides was a medieval Jewish philosopher. So he's considered, in the Orthodox world, he is considered a hero and a giant because one of his major works was codifying Jewish law. So for that, he is celebrated as a big Jewish scholar. On the other hand, he also engaged a lot with scholastic philosophy, medieval scholastic philosophy, of the sort that Thomas Aquinas was engaging with. So looking at the Greeks, Aristotle and Socrates, and trying to make sense of their works in light of a religious theistic worldview. And of course, these philosophical books were not meant to be read by us. Even though it was written by this celebrated scholar, because it engages in secular philosophy, this was a book that we were discouraged from reading. But it was still in the library because it was still part of the Orthodox canon. It was written by a religious scholar. So this was one of the books I got hold of and I started reading. And it opened up a whole new world because even though it was written by an Orthodox scholar, since he was a philosopher, he comes to different conclusions from the conclusions that were widely held in my community. So for example, in his works, I, for the first time, discovered the idea that some of the science mentioned by the Talmudic rabbis is mistaken. So even though the Talmudic rabbis have complete authority when it comes to legal and religious matters, their science is outdated. And this was something we weren't told in our community. In our community, everything written in the Talmud was gospel law, was gospel truth. And here I'm finding an Orthodox rabbi that says that actually it's not the case. So these were just cracks beginning to form in my worldview. At a later point, I started teaching myself English. So I found some children's books in English, and I got hold of a dictionary, and I would just read there and read word by word, read a word and look it up in the dictionary and so on. Once I got a basic understanding of English, I was able to get hold of science books. Now, this wasn't something I could be open about because I wasn't meant to read these books. But I went to the library, I borrowed some books and sneaked it back in to my dormitory room and hid it under my mattress. And when nobody was seeing on the loo, I would read these books. And that's when more and more cracks started to form because I really saw the discrepancies between modern science and the stories told, the Bible and the Talmud.
How old were you when you started to question those things?
It was a slow evolution over, I would say I started questioning when I was 13 and it only culminated when I was 20. I lost my faith completely when I was 20. Right. So over all these years, it was just a matter of asking questions, receiving answers, being happy for a while, then realizing the answer isn't satisfying, asking again, and so on. Right? And anyone familiar with fundamentalist religion knows that it isn't the questions you ask always have an answer, and you then ask again, and you show how the answer's faulty. There's another answer waiting. So it really is a bottomless pit. But when I was 20, I finally decided that I actually no longer believed. And it was especially, I think what tipped it was discovering higher biblical criticism. So this is an academic discipline that looks at the Bible as a human creation and tries to discover who wrote it and for what reasons. And until that point, I didn't have an alternative for the narrative that the Bible was written by God and given to the Jews on Mount Sinai. There was no alternative. So if I was going to be an atheist or something, I have to explain how these books come to us. And just discovering this academic study of the Bible actually showed how the human origins, the fingerprints of humans are all over the place. You can tell which passages were written in which period and for which political reasons. And the narrative that the Bible has about itself. So the Bible says that Moses wrote them, that Moses wrote the 5 books of Moses, for example, is just not true. They were written, some parts of it were written up to 1,000 years after Moses could ever have lived. And they were written by different people for different reasons. So that was the final straw for me, that not even the basic book is true. Because interestingly, I've gone in my questioning, I went through lots of stages of questioning different parts. So for example, first I just questioned ultra-Orthodoxy, but still be fine with the Orthodox framework. Then I would question the Talmudic framework and say, oh, the rabbis are just making stuff up, but the Bible is still true, right? But this was the point when I was like, well, even the Bible itself, the bedrock of it all, even that was written by humans. So that was when I really decided to let it go, and and I lost my faith completely.
Yeah. Did your family know that you were questioning it, or do they know now that you no longer identify with what you were raised with?
Yes. So, but now I've left the community completely. It's not the kind of community where there is place for an atheist, or where you can, just go ahead with your life and pretend to believe in church. It's a community where religion is all encompassing. Mm-hmm. If you want to go to university, even if you still fully believe, there is no place for you. So, given that I wanted to start a secular life and I did want to go to university, there really wasn't a place for me. So I did have to come out to my family about it.
How'd that go?
Not very well. Not very well. No. Pretty much with immediate effect, I was completely shunned from the community. My friends and family were told by rabbis that they mustn't talk to me. I lost contact to all of my siblings. As you can imagine, I'm from a big family. I'm the oldest of 10.
Mm-hmm. Oh, wow.
I lost contact. Yeah. I lost contact to all of my siblings. I was exiled from the community. I was homeless for a time. After a while, my parents did start talking to me again. And I have now a really good relationship with them. But I'm still not allowed home. I'm not allowed in the community. I pretty much have almost no contact with any of my former community members and with family, grandparents, and so on.
Was there anybody else in the community that you were close with, that you could talk about your skepticism with, or that was, also questioning it at the same time you were?
Yes. So during the various stages of my questioning, when I went, from mild questioning to more severe questioning and more severe questioning. So during each of these stages, I had a couple of people who would eventually find my questioning going too far. So at the early stages, they'd be like, oh yeah, that's an interesting thought. We should think about that. We should ask together. But then when I said, okay, you know what? It's no longer just a curiosity. It's no longer a question. I actually don't believe in it. They'd be like, okay, you're going too far. And this would happen at every stage. So almost until the very last stage of my questioning, I had some friends, not many, some 1 or 2 people I could talk with. But at the very end, they refused. They were like, okay, look, this has gone too far. We have to stop here. You're going into dangerous territory. I got a message recently, really recently, roughly a month ago on Facebook. So community members are not allowed to go on the internet. So this was a anonymous Facebook under a false name. Mm-hmm. He didn't tell me who he was. I still don't know. He told me, the message read, I was with you in religious college when you left. I remember your journey, and I regret not coming along with you. And that was the message. That was what the message was. I tried to get back to this individual, but he disappeared. And I suspect it's one of these friends whom I was questioning with, but who decided the last minute he doesn't want to leave, and maybe now, 4 years later, maybe he's changed his mind and he regrets not leaving with me. I don't know.
Well, I mean, I think it's important that, I mean, you're putting yourself out there as having done this. I mean, you had an article written about you for this. I mean, maybe there are about the fact that you were from an ultra Orthodox community like that. I mean, maybe by doing that, maybe that individual and maybe others will have sort of gathered the courage to do so. And I think it's a good thing that you're back in touch with your parents. I mean, maybe the fact that there is some positivity after the shunning, the shunning obviously is not great, but I mean, that it doesn't have to be all bad forever could end up giving some people some hope.
Absolutely, and it's not only a maybe. I've seen this happen. One of the biggest reasons for why I decided to be open with my story and tell it was because when I was in that situation, and I had already lost my faith, I was still in religious college, and so the community has a narrative about people who leave, right? So people who leave are miserable, they're usually suicidal, and they either come back to the community or they die alone, right? Mm-hmm. That's the narrative they have. And it has some truth to it. It's self-fulfilling, because if you are going to shun individuals after not having given them any education or any tools to survive in the outside world, then if they leave, then yes, this could happen. So when I was already not believing, I was still very reluctant to physically leave because I didn't want to end up that way. And it all changed when I came across online. I came across an interview with a couple of former Hasidic Jews from Brooklyn, New York, who did a similar thing 5 years before I did. And they were being interviewed, and they were all living successful lives. One of them was doing a PhD in microbiology. One of them was an aspiring actress. And I contacted them. I got hold of their details. I contacted them. And I asked them, is it true what the community says, that everyone who leaves is necessarily miserable? And they're like, no, we left. We're very happy. And yes, it's tough, and not everyone makes it. But if you're resilient, if you really want to make it, you can. And that's when I decided I was going to leave. And, thank goodness, I'm now in a similar position as they were. I'm now happy and settled. I've gone past the difficult transition years. Now I want to send the same message to others and tell them it's possible. You can do it. It's difficult, but you can do it. And I've had many, many people reach out to me, some anonymously, some openly, reach out to me from the community saying, look, I'm sitting in the toilet of my religious college here and I'm typing to you. I saw your story online and I'm thinking I might want to leave too. Do you have any advice? I receive messages like these on a weekly basis. So it definitely makes a change.
What advice do you give them?
It depends. So I don't want to tell people, look, definitely leave, it'll definitely be good, because that will be a massive responsibility on my shoulder. And sadly, it's not the case. Not everyone who leaves can make it. So I first try to find out if this individual speaks English. How much research have they done about the secular world? Mm-hmm. How ready are they to leave? Do they have the necessary tools? On what is their decision to leave based? Sometimes I refer them, not sometimes, I always refer them to a charity that exists in the UK. It's called Mava, which in Hebrew means transition. It's a charity set up to help individuals in that situation, and they are trained and they know what to deal with these situations. So rather than me telling them exactly what to do, I refer them to that charity. I tell them a little about my story, about the hardships, and about how if you're going to make it, you have to be willing. You have to know there'll be a difficult period, I can't tell people whether to leave or not to leave, but I can tell them how it was with me, and I can inform their decision.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point, that you're right. Every situation is going to be different. But would you say that, like, you would tell maybe a woman who was raised into that community something different than you would tell a man that was raised into that community, just based off of fundamentally what they're raised into in that?
Not necessarily. I've had fewer women contact me. Um, I guess maybe I talk more to men. I mean, given how isolated men and women are brought up in the community and how fundamentally different they were.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know if people know, but I didn't speak with a woman other than my mum for 7 years. From my bar mitzvah, when we're 13, we become adults in Jewish law.
Mm-hmm. We're
not allowed to talk to women, and I didn't speak to a woman. So our experiences are very, very different. So I don't know. I don't know if I would advise a woman differently. I'd be mostly reached out to by men or by people anonymously whom I don't know their gender. But my experience is very different to a woman's experience in the community. But I would refer them to other women who have left. I do know women who have left.
Fair enough. No, that's a good point. Would you say that your experience in this has led to you deciding what you wanted to study in college?
Yes, definitely the philosophy part. I think most people take for granted the kind of worldview they were raised in. You have an epistemological framework, or we would call it a framework of viewing the world, and you tend, even if you might change specific views, you tend to stick to the rough framework, a framework of what is ultimately important, what are the sources of knowledge. People tend to keep these frameworks. If you have to go through a period in your life where you have to dismantle these very, very frameworks, so suddenly you're left without a system of morality because all your moral sources that you used to trust are no longer reliable.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have a source for discovering truth because the Bible used to be your source of truth and you no longer trust it. Then suddenly you kind of have a real existential crisis, but not in the sense of, I don't know the meaning of life. You're just not grounded. You don't have a framework with which to view the world. And I think for me, that it was very important for me to study philosophy, to kind of rebuild such a framework for myself, to discover, how do we view the world and what gives us sources of morality and knowledge.
I get that, and you know what, it's you're touching on something that's been something I've been thinking about a lot recently, which is that it's kind of tough for me to say whether or not the world would be the way that it is right now, or that human morality would be what it is right now if it weren't for religion. Like, if the golden rule is really enough for us to determine what we should or should not be doing for each other, and whether or not we can even think about these things, if whether or not we are free enough to be able to consider these things, if it weren't for the fact that religion has sort of set this groundwork for us to go on. And I maybe you've thought about this with studying philosophy and with what you've thought about as well. But I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Like, if we would really be, and there are of course people that are immoral, but do you think we would be as moral of a society if we didn't have religion?
I don't know. I tend to see it the other way around. So rather than seeing religion as forming morality, I see as morality forming religion. So I think the specific ways of religion viewing morality it comes from societal ways of viewing morality. So it's not religion setting a trend, it's religion following a trend.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I tend to think. So I would think, I don't know, maybe an anthropologist would be much more suited to answer this question. But from what I understand, it does seem to me that people impose their moral views on their religions. As to the question, I mean, this opens a wider question, doesn't it? If we can, assuming we eliminate religious morality altogether, where do we start rebuilding a totally secular morality? I mean, can we have a kind of morality in a void and a kind of scientific way of just viewing what's true, morally speaking, and just follow it to the conclusions? This is a wider question about morality. I mean, is morality culturally dependent? Is it grounded in culture, in views? Or is there some sort of absolute kind of scientific moral way of living?
Yeah, and that's I think where I've been stuck on recently because I think about people that were raised in the fundamental Mormon groups where they live in the desert, and yet there are still people from those groups that escape because they feel like there's something wrong. And I'm thinking about what you're telling me with this, where you're raised in something where you're totally cut off from society. You're not even reading the same language, and yet something drew you to wanting to research and maybe there's an element of chance, like maybe you just happened to read this book, and I'm absolutely not negating that could be a big part of it, but I don't know if it maybe what do you think? Like, do you think we have some sort of fundamental morality, or do you think it is just from your personal opinion, do you think that it's all sort of a combination of nature and nurture, and then we kind of figure out what it is from there on out?
They're two separate questions. In philosophical jargon would be called descriptive and prescriptive, right? So a descriptive question is looking at people and how they behave morally. Where does it come from? Does it come from reason, or does it come from nurture, from habit?
Mm-hmm.
A second question is, how should we? So forget about what people do. If we can design morality anew, if we can restart, is there a way to restart it on objective grounds? Now, with response to the first question, I think it's pretty clear to me and everyone that for most people, morality is just a matter of upbringing and nurture. I mean, most people don't go about their lives thinking of moral questions and, forgetting about what they were brought up to believe and just thinking about it from their own minds. Mm-hmm. I think that's fair, right?
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that the answer to the second question will be that morality has to be grounded in religion. It is still possible that we can design morality or discover morality without reference to culture or religion. That's a separate question.
How would you think that you would go about discovering it? And do you have you thought about what a method of that would be?
Right. So this is a massive subject in philosophy. We've studied this. It's called metaethics. So metaethics is the question of, first of all, do moral facts exist? So we have physical facts like the sun rises in the morning, regardless of the Earth revolves around the sun, but the sun comes up in the morning, right? It's a physical fact. The question is, are there analogous moral facts? So let's say a statement, murder is wrong, right? Does this have a true or false value analogous to a physical statement, right? So if I say it's day now, you can either say, yes, you're right, it's day, or no, you're wrong, it's night. The question is, does a moral statement like murder is wrong, does it have a yes or no answer? Can you say, yes, murder is wrong, or no, murder is not wrong? This is the crux of metaethics. And personally, I mean, there are lots of different views. Personally, I think you can't really. It's not the kind of fact that has a truth value, a yes or no answer. Murder is wrong is not the kind of statement that you can say, well, objectively speaking, it is wrong. It's not the kind of statement that has that kind of value. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. Finish your thought.
That's one position in metaethics. It's called moral error theory. So it considers all talk of ethics and morality as just a mistake. There is no such thing as morality. It doesn't exist.
What if you just thought about it mathematically? Like, killing an enemy soldier will lessen their ranks by 1, but maybe converting an enemy soldier into an ally will actually increase your strength and decrease their strength at the same time. So maybe the moral that you can take from that is that murder is wrong on the basis of the fact that even in that case, you can get even stronger by not murdering.
Right. So this goes into a slightly, so again, using jargon, but I'll explain what I mean. There's a difference between something called the categorical imperative and hypothetical imperative. Kant coined these terms. A hypothetical imperative is a goal that I have set myself. I didn't have to, but I wanted to. So for example, if I set myself a goal, I want to graduate in 2 years' time, right? There's a moral imperative gets born out of that to study. So that means relative to my goal of graduating, I should study because otherwise I won't graduate, right? But this is not a categorical imperative because the goal itself is somewhat arbitrary. I may as well not have set myself that goal, in which case I would have no obligation to study.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So going back to morality, it's very easy to set up hypothetical imperatives. So if I say, for example, that my goal for the universe is that there should be as little suffering as possible in it, then it's very easy to create a moral system. All you have to do is ask yourself, for any given action, do I increase or decrease the suffering of the world by doing this?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that would be your morality. But a moral skeptic would say, well, the goal itself is arbitrary. Well, good for you that you have set up the goal of decreasing suffering in the world. But how would you argue against me? And I don't have that goal. So that means there is no categorical imperative to decrease suffering. So in your example of the soldier, in the war case, in the war metaphor that you used, the war, there is a goal that we've set ourselves, that is to win the war. And relative to that goal, yes, there are very clear instructions what we should do if we want to reach that goal. But the question is, what if I question the goal itself? Do I have to have that goal? What if I don't share that goal?
And also, I guess, if you use the metaphor of just wanting to have the least suffering possible, suffering could be somewhat subjective. Like, there could be that the least suffering that is possible could also be something that hurts you later. Like, you know, if you think that disciplining somebody will make them suffer, maybe also that person needed discipline so that they would do less to suffer later on. Or something
Right.
like that, like healthy choices and you know, not hurting others, that kind of thing.
So there's sophisticated attempts to get away of this problem. There's a school of philosophy called utilitarianism. It was started by Jeremy Bentham, an English philosopher, and then carried on by John Stuart Mill. Utilitarianism is a kind of, like you say, mathematical. You use it's a very appropriate word. It's a calculus, a way of calculating, adding up negative aspects and positive aspects, and seeing if the total is a positive number, then you do it. If the total is a negative number, then you don't do it. So, for example, if I say, we're going to go to war against the Nazis, we are going to have millions of soldiers killed. So that's, of course, a negative. It's suffering. But ultimately, we are going to defeat fascism and Nazism, and therefore have a better society.
Mm-hmm.
So hypothetically, you can give numbers to each of these scenarios, and you can say, okay, the scenario of having Nazism rule the world is negative 100. The scenario of having 1 million soldiers die in a war is negative 50. Adding them up, I see that the war scenario, going to war against the Nazis, yes, it has negative 50, but I take away a negative 100. So I end up with plus 50, right? Because in the other scenario, I'd have negative 100. And here I only have negative 50. So I end up with a difference of 50, of plus 50, right? So going to war against the Nazis increases happiness in the world by 50 units. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I could see that as also being something that could end up being almost cold in nature at the same time. It's like the ends justify the means, and therefore you can do anything as long as you're doing it for the greater good.
That's exactly what utilitarians say. It's not something that just results from their philosophy. It's something that they proudly declare. That is their philosophy, that all that you care about is the ends.
So, but, I mean, does that, would you say that that's the case all the time, though? I mean, I mean, because, again, the ends in that case, that would be, you said that would be somewhat subjective, because even in that case, it's like, you know, you could say that you're, you know, they're really kind of messed up things that you could say, but like, you know, let's compare it to the way that the settlers came over to the United States, you know, basically wiped out the Native Americans. But let's say that's the only way that we would have discovered cures for cancer, something like that. Let's say that an American discovers a cure for cancer. Does that justify having wiped out the Native Americans?
Right. You can set up very simple thought experiments that show very troubling results. A particularly troubling one, and I hope it doesn't trigger anyone, I've mentioned it as a philosophical concept, is there's a thought experiment that says, what if you have 5 men gang raping 1 woman, right? So you have the woman's misery, that's a negative, okay, but the 5 men are enjoying themselves, add them up, and you have more pleasure than pain, therefore makes it a moral act, right? So this is a very repulsive result.
Yeah.
And it does seem to follow from utilitarianism.
Huh.
Now, utilitarians have ways out of this. You can go down the rabbit hole quite far. So utilitarians would say the reason we feel repulsed by this is not because the act itself is bad, only because it would inspire copycat acts, in which case the runaway effect might be a result of total negativities. For example, if women would stop feeling safe walking on the street because they know that any minute they can be raped by moral people because they think they're allowed to, then these women's life would be very negative, and overall it would result in a negative effect. That's why this act is immoral, because of it would inspire other acts. But what they say is if you were in an isolated island with no effect coming of it, it would be moral.
Okay, so I get that, but I think the problem that I see with that right away is that we're not saying that the copycat would be somebody who, let's say there's like let's say a copycat would be somebody who copies opening up a food kitchen or something like that. Like they see somebody who opened up a food kitchen, so the copycat decides that he's going to open up a food kitchen. We wouldn't say that there's anything immoral about that. So therefore, it's not being a copycat in its nature that's wrong or immoral. So therefore, by saying that, they are saying that there is something immoral about gang rape.
No, the idea is if gang rape becomes normalized, that means that it's no longer only a matter of the misery caused during the act of rape when the men have the pleasure to balance it. It's misery caused to women's life in general because women can no longer walk safely on the street. That means even when they're just doing the shopping and no one is having pleasure out of them, they don't feel safe and they're in constant misery. And that kind of misery would already outweigh the pleasure.
Okay. I think I get that more. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I get that more. Yeah. And I think that's a really important metaphor to use, by the way. I hope nobody else gets triggered either, but like that is
right.
You're right. I mean, that's yeah. So would you say that you've applied any of these sorts of philosophies into your personal life, whether it's utilitarianism or anything else that you've read as sort of a way of living?
I'm still struggling with this. So I haven't reached the pinnacle of my knowledge to be able to say, okay, I've discovered what morality is. I'm still searching. In the spirit of skepticism, I'm still changing my mind all the time. I would say at the moment, I would be less rigid. So utilitarianism tends to be quite rigid mathematically and kind of saying, well, if it has total positivity, go and do it. I would say my general philosophy is to, in some way, without specifying, in some way, it seems to me that the less suffering there is in the world, the better the world is. In some way, not specifying, not going into details. And in some way, the more happiness, the more people who feel content and satisfied, the more the world is a better place. Yeah, that would be my general philosophy. But of course, if you go into details, you end up into very, very messy territory.
Right, because then you get into like overpopulation and things like that.
Exactly. There are some philosophers, and this is a genuine position put forward by philosophers who say giving money to charities who alleviate famine is immoral because the function of famine is to reduce population, which is good because we can't cope with overpopulated Earth. So giving money to alleviate famine is immoral. That's a genuine position. It's a genuine position. And personally, I haven't made up my mind about these things, but I would definitely not say that I would consider someone who gives money to charity to alleviate famine as immoral.
I think that there are enough people in the world at this point that like we would be able to figure out something in the middle. Like that's maybe that's just me being positive or hopeful for what humans are capable of, but I think there's got to be a space in between helping people out and just letting them die for the sake of not being overpopulated.
I don't know. I think these kinds of projections about the future and kind of predictions are almost completely impossible, if not outright impossible. I think if human history is any indication, then it tells us that we can never predict what's going to happen, right?
Sure,
There's always going to be a twist in the story of what's to come. And I think the kind of projections that say, well, in year 2050, this is going to be the case, they're always relative to a certain fact. So if things stay as they are and the projection curve stays constant, then in 2050, this is going to be the fact. But we can never say it without the relative context. We can never say this is what's going to be in 2050 because we really, really cannot know.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I interviewed an ex-Muslim who escaped Iran after he was actually practicing Judaism in Iran, but he was doing so secretly. And his parents were, when they found out, they were going to, turn him in, and he's certain that he would be executed. There is a warrant out for him. Like,
wow.
He lives in the United States now. But
Gosh.
one of the things that I asked him, he said that he is still a very skeptical person. He really values questioning his own faith. He values questioning other people's faiths. And he found that in Judaism, that other Jews were in fact promoting him to do that. Like, they wanted him to, they encouraged him to question his own beliefs, to question their beliefs. He said specifically that, there are these extremist groups of Judaism, which it sounds like one of them was what you were raised into, that he tries to avoid completely because they do not encourage that sort of thought. And I guess I'm still surprised each time when I hear about these groups, like the ones that you're describing, because they do just seem to have a totally different. And I know that's such like a menial statement about it, but like they seem to have such a different view about what you're supposed to do with your Judaism than, I don't know if moderate is the right word, but maybe reform. Reform Jews do about their faith.
Right. It's very interesting in the history of modern Judaism. As I said, Judaism went through a wonderful thing that other religions haven't gone through in the same way, but I hope will happen to other religions. So Judaism went through the Enlightenment, and in the specific context of how Jews lived beforehand, this made a major impact. So Jews, until that point, were confined to ghettos, were denied access to universities. Suddenly they were emancipated, and I'm not sure exactly how and the reasons why this happened, but within the span of a century, literally a century, Jews went from being 100% religious to 90% secular. Can you imagine? Millions of Jews worldwide, within the span of a century, suddenly in their masses, lose their religion. It's a phenomenon that hasn't happened in history with another religion. As a result of that, I'm not sure why it's happened. As a result of that, the Jews who did try to keep elements of religion to their Jewish identity adapted a very moderate religion that you can call reform or liberal or progressive or whatever. And it's right. Most Jews, even religious Jews, are very, very moderate and very skeptical themselves. And it's not even a rare thing to find atheist rabbis who will tell you they outright do not believe in God. They're rabbis because they see value in community and in ritual and so on. And it is a very, very common thing.
But at the same time, I mean, I guess you have the other side of it, which is that a lot of people who are raised Jewish, no matter what their community is, they are still taught that no matter what they believe, they're always going to be Jewish.
Right. Yes, that's the other side of it. That's the other side. There's the side that people feel this is not something they can escape or leave behind. And that, yes, I personally don't hold that view. I think I personally choose to be Jewish, and I'm fine with it, but I don't think it's the kind of thing that you can't walk away from. I think if somebody doesn't feel they still want to be Jewish, then of course, by all means, walk away. I think people think that that's not the case because they see Judaism as more of an ethnicity or a culture, and that's not clear that's the kind of thing that one can walk away from.
Yeah. And I think for some people it is an ethnicity at the same time. Like, maybe I'm mistaken, but I've always, from my understanding, has always been that, like, you can say that you're Jewish, and that means that you believe in the religion of what we now view as Judaism. Or you can say that you're Jewish, and that means that you can trace your history back to, I don't know if it's the Israelites or if it's others that are sort of seen as like the original Jews in a way. I don't know if that's the right term, but in that way, it's like you sort of have a thought ethnicity, but you also do have a cultural ethnicity that can both be called Jewish.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And it's possible that first of all, it has a true element to it. As I said, Jews really did exist before the Jewish religion existed. So in that sense, it really is an ethnic cultural identity. Because religion only came later to it. It's like when somebody says they're British but they're not Christian. We don't say, well, Britain has the Anglican Church as a Christian country, because we understand that Britain existed before it became Christian.
Right, yeah.
The second aspect, and I wonder how important this is, for the last 2,000 years, Jews have lived as minority communities in foreign countries.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that really, really reinforces on one, if one is forced into this externally imposed isolation, then you really do internalize the kind of narrative that we are different. And perhaps, I don't know, but perhaps this kind of narrative doesn't go away even when you lose faith in the religion. It means, yes, you no longer believe, but you're still the other, you're still the minority. And maybe over the generations, you've developed a kind of identity to counter that persecution. A self-identity, and maybe you want to hold on to that even after you've lost the religion.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Does your family, when you talk to your parents now, do they still consider you Jewish, or do they acknowledge your view that you are no longer Jewish?
No, I consider myself Jewish.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's right. You said that you don't believe that you can never be Jewish anymore. You're right. My mistake. Sorry. Sorry, you're right. I misunderstood. Okay, so you still consider yourself Jewish. Do they accept what that means to you now?
Yes and no. So my parents don't believe in such a thing as Jewish culture. So they say if you don't believe in the faith and in God, then you're not practicing Judaism. You're living just like a non-Jew, and it's meaningless for you. So that's where they don't understand me. So for example, when I tell them, oh, I've rested on the Sabbath and I've done a Jewish thing, they're like, well, no, you haven't done it as God's commandment, so it doesn't become Jewish. So that's the part in which they don't see my practices as Jewish. And they would also, for example, they wouldn't acknowledge a Reform rabbi. They wouldn't consider him or her a rabbi. They're not a rabbi. They're not a real rabbi. On the other hand, in Jewish law, there's a concept that one is born a Jew and one dies a Jew. So if one was born to a Jewish mother, according to Jewish law, no matter what they do, they can convert to any religion, they can transgress as much as they want, they are still Jewish in the sense that they're still obligated to practice all the Jewish laws. Mm-hmm. And they still have the special status of being a Jew. So if they repent, even if it's very late in life, it's as if nothing happened. They were just always a Jew. So in that sense, my parents still consider me a Jew, but they don't consider me to be practicing Judaism.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
How were you raised to view sex just in general? Like, was there any sort of sex education, and how has your education as far as sex goes changed as your faith has changed?
What sex? I don't know what that is. Kidding. But that was how I was for most of my life. We didn't get any sex education. We didn't talk about sex at all. We were never told it existed. So the standard practice is that boys and girls, the night before their wedding, there's a special bride and groom teacher. Separately, for the women, it's a bride teacher. For the boys, it's a groom teacher, who will inform the kids the night before their wedding, or sometimes a week before the wedding, just before the wedding, they'll be told sex is a thing. This is how you do it. You're going to be doing it in a week's time or tomorrow.
Huh.
Now, by that point, most people have figured something out because it doesn't take much to realize that something's going on, but it's not discussed and you're not told anything about it.
What about just like the basic human things that happen, like, waking up with an erection, or how is, masturbation viewed and things like that?
So everything is spoken about in euphemisms. So there's a concept um, in mystical and Kabbalistic terms, the penis is called the covenant. Okay, it may sound weird, but the penis is called the limb of the covenant. So it's kind of like a covenant between you and God. And if you don't masturbate, if you keep yourself holy and pure, then you're keeping the covenant. And if you don't keep your thoughts pure and you do masturbate, then you're violating the covenant. So we were never explicitly told don't masturbate because, I don't know if I should be ashamed to say this. I didn't know that masturbation was a thing until I was 19. I didn't know it was a thing. So in order to guard those who don't even know about it, our teachers would never say don't masturbate. But in order to make sure that those who do know about it know that it's forbidden, they would say you always have to keep your thoughts pure and you have to guard your covenant. And by keeping your thoughts pure, this was specified. So looking at women is forbidden, thinking of women is forbidden, and touching yourself is forbidden.
Mm-hmm.
So there's very strict laws about it. You're not, even when you're peeing, a man, you're peeing, you're not allowed to touch your penis because it might bring you an erection.
Huh.
There are methods described in Jewish law how you should make sure that you're aiming without touching your penis.
Huh. That's so specific.
Very specific.
And you should not be embarrassed about the fact that you didn't know about it until you said you were 19. You said.
Yeah.
So I spoke with an ex-Mormon and who said that she didn't know about masturbation until her mid-20s. But slightly different from your story, she said that she didn't know she just didn't know that was what it was called. She was actually like doing it. She was masturbating, but she didn't actually know that was masturbation. She had no idea that it was even sexual in nature, and nobody spoke about it. So there was no education on it. So she had no idea what was going on.
Right. No, I didn't even know that the mechanism works. When I woke up after a wet dream, I didn't know what happened.
Yeah.
I thought I peed myself.
Yeah.
One thing we were told, though, is if you do wake up after a wet dream, I didn't know what it was, but you're told you have to immerse yourself in a ritual bath afterwards to clean yourself. So I will do that.
How have your views about sex changed now that you view yourself as a Jewish atheist?
I mean, it's just the regular secular attitudes towards sex. I mean, I have a girlfriend now. It's just regular for me. It has taken a while in the beginning to get used to the idea, not even to the idea of sex. Even just talking to women was a challenge in the beginning because, as I said, I did grow up absolutely isolated from women.
Mm-hmm.
So I had mentoring on that. I had very caring friends who were patient with me. But now I'm just the regular secular folk,
Yeah.
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 Yeah, and we were talking about utilitarianism earlier. Like I associate sometimes with the teachings about premarital sex and like just having one partner and all of that stuff. I mean, I guess I think sometimes that it in the sense of the fact that there is, to some degree, there is value to disciplining yourself to to not masturbating and to waiting until marriage. I did not wait until marriage. I'm not saying that everybody should, but I think it's like an extremist view to say that that like everybody needs to just get out there and get with as many people as they can, and it's also an extremist view to say that you have to wait until marriage and that's the only way to do it. But I think that everybody kind of needs to figure out what works for them. I think that I can't stand it when there are people that get bullied for being virgins. But I also don't think that there's any value in slut shaming. I think that they're both kind of stupid.
I absolutely agree. I think in general, I mean, we know now after the Me Too movement and scandals about sexual misconduct coming out, I think there's something inherently messed up about our sex culture. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it can be fixed. Maybe it's just the nature of something as messy as sex, with emotions involved. I don't know. But there is a problem. Sex isn't perfect. So it's nice to pretend that it's just, you just go out there, you sleep with people. For some people it works, as you say. I don't think it's perfect. It can leave people emotionally vulnerable. Personally, I find that if it's with a person whom I love, it can add a special connection. It feels right, and it adds a deep emotional layer. But that doesn't mean that it's always good. And yeah, I definitely agree about pressurizing people into it. That that's not healthy and not helpful.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I don't think that everything can necessarily be put, can be associated with, or the reason for views on things can always be necessarily put immediately onto religion. But I do think that religion plays an enormous role in this. I mean, in the United States, the states that have the strongest rules and laws and regulations about what can and can't be taught about sex ed are also the ones that have the highest concentrations of people who identify as being deeply religious. So I know that correlation, or what's the term? It's like just because
there does not equal causation.
Correct. That's the one. Thank you. Despite that fact, I mean it's kind of difficult to ignore that when it happens in every single one of those states.
Well, we know we don't have to go to statistics because we know that many religious groups outright say that they don't believe in sex ed, right?
True, yeah.
And we know on the fundamentalist side of the spectrum, religious groups say they don't believe in sex ed in schools. So, yeah, I mean, they say it. We know that's the case.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's not even that you're right. It's not even the statistics. Yeah. It's right there in what they're saying to every single person they know.
There's a massive thing going on now with my former community here in the UK. So the government, Ofsted is the governmental organization that looks over schools here in the UK. They've recently, after decades of pretty much ignoring ultra-Orthodox schools, they've started looking into them, and they've started getting stricter with them. Now, one of the things they've been focusing on is lack of sex ed in schools, and not only sex ed, also teaching about alternative lifestyles, like homosexual couples, about transgender people. And there's been a massive backlash from the community, with many parents claiming that they're being taken away their religious freedom to bring up their kids in the way that they feel right. Now, there's lots of opinions going around about this. Personally, I think this whole issue is a red herring, because when I think about my upbringing in the community, the most damage that was done to me was not by the lack of sex ed, it was by the lack of education altogether. And by the fact that we were also abused by teachers. The teachers weren't qualified, they hit us, and there was no oversight on, to make sure the teachers have training and so on. And I think when people in this case, when people get entangled over questions of how much the government should impose in terms of sex ed, they completely deflecting from the much more important issue that's going on, that thousands of kids are being raised without being to talk a word of English. That for me is so much more important. If the community came out and said, well, you know what, we are going to educate our children well, and we're going to teach them English, and we're going to make sure that there's no more hitting of kids and that teachers are qualified, it would be a tiny concern for me that there is no sex ed. It will be a tiny, tiny concern.
So the poor sex education is almost like a symptom of the greater disease, which is just poor education in general.
Absolutely. And I don't think it's good that the governmental organization is focusing on that, because then the community finds sympathy with other fundamentalist religious groups, and they gather support and say, look, the government is imposing its secular values on us. Whereas if the government would just focus on plain education and plain child welfare, then the community would have no sympathies with anyone, because almost everyone agrees that basic sex education and welfare for kids is important.
Yeah. And have your Did you ever really consider yourself deeply devout in what you were brought up in, or would you say that you kind of were always like when you look back on it right now, like do you think you were kind of going through the motions, or do you think that you were, actually really believing it like deeply in your heart at the time?
I was always very, very serious. I'm still a very serious person. What I believe, I take with utmost conviction. And yes, when I was in the community, I believed in it. I was very, very pious. I followed every letter of the law. I never like did any transgressions or anything like that. I was a very, very serious, devout person. And I always tried, even during the periods when I was questioning. I was genuinely looking for answers. I didn't want to rebel. It wasn't that I was desperate to eat that bacon or, I just had questions and I wanted to answer them. And I was really just trying to be the best, God-serving person I could. And I
Yeah.
was very, very proud. Yeah.
And do you think that your political views that you have right now, whether it's about education or really anything else, has changed in the time that you've been in the community and with where you are right now?
Oh, they haven't changed. They've been born anew. I didn't have any political views in the community because we didn't, as I said, we really were isolated from society. We had no clue. I mean, most of us anyway had no clue who the prime minister was, what
Hmm.
the big issues were. We didn't read the newspapers. We really didn't know what was going on. So, in terms of the big political discussions, I don't know, abortion, feminism, these kinds of things, I had no clue they were going on.
Hmm.
So I didn't really have any view on them.
Not even like economically, like nobody really. Well, I know that you said it's sort of like its own economy, where you would buy from other, the stores would be owned by other ultra orthodox people. So I guess in a way it sort of sets up its own community. But I guess I'm surprised that there weren't some political, statements that were made just in terms of what it would take to keep the community where it was.
Right. So during election times, how it works is there are a couple of um, people at the head of the community, some community leaders, not rabbis, more kind of secular leaders. By secular, I don't mean not from the community. I mean as opposed to religious leaders. They will familiarize themselves with a political situation. They'll reach a decision which party is best for the community's interest, and then they'll just tell the community who will usually vote as a bloc for that party. Because the community is very poor and they all have a lot of children, almost all of them rely on benefits.
Hmm.
So they would almost always, as a bloc, vote for Labour, which is it's not quite analogous to the American political system, but if it's most similar to any party, it's like the Democrat equivalent. So it's the party for social welfare and benefits. And it's very interesting because you often think of conservative communities as being more to the right. So I know in America, it's usually the religious who vote Republican, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and Labour is, so to speak, the more progressive community in this country. But because the community was so dependent on these benefits, they almost always vote Labour. But again, it wasn't a matter of us making an informed decision. I was never involved with politics. I never knew much. It was more that we were being told this is what you need to vote for, and we went out and voted for it.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Huh. I don't actually think I've got any other questions. I mean, this was great. I mean, was there anything else that you wanted to say? Anything you wanted to say to other Jewish people, to people who've maybe been where you were, from those communities? Anything else that you just wanted to say in general that maybe I didn't get a chance to ask about?
Yeah, there is something that now I'm quite involved in. So I've kind of moved on from, my past life, and I'm now quite involved on campus. I founded last winter. I founded a free speech society on my university campus. And this is, I don't know if you have any strong opinions on this matter, or if you've heard about these things. I'm quite concerned by some instances of censorship
Hmm.
in campus, with people being more strict and limiting, narrowing the limits of what can and cannot be said on campus.
Yeah.
And I see in it, interestingly, a lot of parallels, not in the same degree, but in the same kind, a lot of parallels to the kind of religious repression that I face, the kind of telling you can't think about certain things, you can't see that, you can't ask that. It's kind of quite upsetting to me when secular people who grew up in a culture where there's freedom of speech, instead of using that, instead of being skeptical, asking tough questions, they want to limit the discussion. So this is one thing. I don't know if you have any thoughts on this.
I do. Yeah, I do. And it's something that I've been seeing a lot over here. You're right. And I think that for me, I mean, college, university, whatever, it's supposed to be the place where you learn about all the things that you just learn all the things. You learn information. And it shouldn't be about what adheres to your worldview. It shouldn't be about what keeps you safe. It's supposed to be about you just learning about the world. That's just supposed to be what it is. There's been one thing that's really bothered me in the time that I've been doing this show. When I've been speaking with ex-Muslims, the people that are the most reluctant to take their sides tend to be people who are on the left side politically, because they don't want to upset Muslims. But in the process of doing so, they've associated with, like, elevating things like the hijab, when they don't even realize that this is something that there are, many women where the hijab has been used against them. It's not a feminist thing to them, and we've used it as such. So I mean, there's this weird misunderstanding with a lot of people about just what Islam is, and what we're allowed to say, and what we're allowed to talk about, and what we're allowed to hear. And obviously there's a lot more than just what's going on with Islam. I mean, I believe that if you go into a college, I mean, we should definitely be, exposed to all the things that we agree with and all the things that we disagree with, and we should be allowed to make our own decisions. We shouldn't be protesting somebody just because we disagree with them, and we definitely shouldn't have a headmaster who says that we're not going to allow a speaker just because we have a group of people who think that person is spouting hate speech, when maybe they are, maybe they aren't, but like it's not hate speech in like what we've viewed hate speech to be for the last like 40 years by comparison.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's also, I mean, from my personal experience of questioning dogmas and being skeptical, I would like to see more skepticism around.
Mm-hmm.
People think that it's a virtue to be certain. I mean, I'm of course, being passionate in what you believe has certain virtues. It drives you to action and so on. But certainty and dogmatism is not a virtue. And somehow people think that it should, there should be some orthodoxies enforced, which we shouldn't question. And I don't like that. I would like to see people being more skeptical, just asking questions. Even, sometimes I'll have discussions. I'll just have, for the sake of argument, I'll try and refute someone who shares my views, right? I'll just have a discussion with them, for the other side, because we should always question our own views. We should be self-skeptical.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just what I would love to wish more. And that applies to religion, of course, but even to secular so-called religions, to political ideologies. It applies very much these days.
Yeah, and I mean, I was raised on the left side of things, and to see that it is so many people that are on the left that are against so much of what really is free speech. The real the real virtue of free speech is when you allow somebody who disagrees with you to speak. Like that's when it really matters. If you don't believe that somebody who disagrees with you should speak, then you don't actually believe in free speech. And that's something that I really hope more people start to understand soon.
Yeah, and how are you gonna discover if you're wrong? Assume you happen to be wrong on one opinion. How are you gonna find out that you're wrong if you don't let others who disagree question you? I mean, the great thing for me about free speech is not only about allowing others to speak, but allowing them to question my own beliefs. Because if I am mistaken about the world, I want to be the first to know it,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the best way I can find it out is by hearing people who disagree with me talk. And then I can hear their point, and I can decide whether, yes, they've refuted me, I have to change my view, or no, I disagree with them.
Right.
But if I shut out other opinions, then I'm just gonna die being wrong. I don't want that.
Right. Right. I was at work the other day, and one of my coworkers asked a question, and nobody knew how to answer, but I knew immediately how to answer. He asked, if you were wrong about, everything in life, would you want to know? And I was like, absolutely. And he was like, yeah, but it would mean that it would mean that you're wrong. I mean, how could you go through life like that? And I was like, well, if you tell me that I'm wrong, then you're giving me the opportunity to find out the truth. And I'd rather go through my life, wondering about the truth and trying to figure it out than going through my life, thinking that I'm right and, everybody knows that I'm wrong or that there is something else out there. I mean, absolutely. I think there's so much value in saying that I'm wrong or also saying I don't know. And we've stigmatized both of them, unfortunately.
Yeah. I mean, it's the classical blue versus red pill, isn't it?
Hmm.
Yeah.
No,
But
and
I guess you're a red pillar.
I guess so. But I think that it's an interesting point that you made, that it sounds a lot like how there have been these censorships that have been done by religious people, and now it's people that think that they're being open-minded by censoring. And
Yeah.
I don't know, like I think that maybe I think that maybe they're coming from a good place, like they believe that by being intolerant of people that they view as being intolerant, that in doing so they're being tolerant.
Yeah.
Maybe that by not allow, but by avoiding letting people speak who are saying things that they think might hurt marginalized groups or that are against those marginalized groups. Like I think sometimes it's coming from a good place, but
I definitely think, yeah.
But I think
Yeah.
that there is such a thing as like radical lack of xenophobia or something. Like there is a
Yeah.
point that when you get to that level that you in effect are being bigoted in a way.
I mean, we see it nowadays. I mean, you have people who go around with T-shirts saying "fuck Trump supporters,"
Right.
right? I
Right.
mean, this is basically a T-shirt expressing hate towards at least 50% of the population.
Right.
But how is that? And the people who wear the T-shirt think that they are, to the contrary, they are just denouncing the haters, right? The Trump supporters are the haters
Hmm.
whom they are denouncing. But that's not how it works. You don't eradicate hate by hating more.
Right.
You eradicate hate by hating less.
Yeah.
Yeah, you see it so often. I mean, I've been called on campus all kinds of names. I've been called a transphobe, a bigot, just because I say we should let people talk. So,
Yeah.
in the name of eradicating hate, I've faced a lot of hate by these same people. I don't think that's how you eradicate hate. I prefer to think of eradicating hate just, by not hating. Let's just not hate each other.
Hmm.
It's a
Let's have
radical idea.
let's have a
Let's just not hate.
conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, let's talk and not hate.
Right.
Very radical.
Right.
Very radical.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I don't really, think that I'm like on the far right. I like to consider myself a centrist. As I've gotten
Mm,
older, I've found things that are on the right that I agree with. I've found things that are on the left that I
yeah.
agree with. But I work for a conservative company, so I work for and with a lot of Trump supporters. And you know what? They're great.
Mm, yeah.
They're great. I haven't had anybody say something to me that's incredibly ignorant. I haven't had anybody come up to me in a "Make America Great Again" hat that is expecting me to have his view. We just kind of do our
Yeah.
job.
Yeah.
I know what their views are, and they accept me for doing my job. We've hired trans people. We've hired people of different
Yeah.
races. As long as they're doing it's about the purest meritocracy that I could possibly see, and it's a good thing. If they can do their job, that's all that matters.
Well, but meritocracy itself is just the white way of asserting power, isn't it? According to this narrative.
Yeah, I'll
Yeah.
never understand that.
Yeah. Meritocracy is just about those in power remaining power. What we really need is equity. Uh, yeah, but that's a different conversation.
There's a lot to go
Yeah.
on with this. Yeah, and I think what bothers me is that it is coming from a good place. And I think that
Yeah.
it's sort of like what I was telling you about Quakerism, where it's like, if you
Yeah.
stand against it, then it's like, my standing against Quakerism or walking away from Quakerism made people believe that I wasn't believing in peace. It's like by saying
Yeah.
that you think that the views that people have that are all about everybody being given an equal chance, or everything being, whatever, that, like, if you even say something that might be contrary to it a little bit, then you're a racist, you're a bigot, you're a xenophobe. And it's like, no, I just think that your view on it is taking it to an extreme, and that there are people that are different from you that believe that doing things based on merit is actually good. So are you alienating them? I mean, what's going on here?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good thing to acknowledge that most of these people are coming from a good place, because that prevents us from falling into the very same trap. And this is quite meta, but you can end up hating people for hating people who hate people.
Yeah. Oh my God.
So
yeah.
you don't like social justice warriors for hating haters, but then you hate them.
Right.
So I think a good way to stay balanced is to realize that these people come from a good place. So we shouldn't hate them. I don't hate them, but I do think they're misled. I mean, how is a statement like all Trump supporters are bigoted? How is this statement not a bigoted statement in itself? This is such a bigoted statement to say.
It is. It is. Very simply, it is a bigoted statement.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Because first of all, it's saying that all Trump supporters are exactly the same. And then which is not true. And I didn't vote for Trump, and I'm not going to vote for him when when the election comes up again. But I'm going to stand with the people that did, and I'm going to stand with the people that didn't. I believe that we just need to talk. I've been bringing this up a bit recently, and what you're talking about right now. There's there are two people that have been really inspiring for me over the last couple of years as I've been questioning my own religion. There's this one guy named Daryl Davis, who's a black musician from the United States that has convinced something like 200 KKK members to give up their hoods and robes and to renounce their own racist views, not by like protesting them, but by like having conversations with them in his house and in bars.
Wow.
That's it. That's all he does. He just talks to them.
Wow.
And he considers he considers a lot of these people his best friends now.
Right.
And there's also the documentarian Dia Khan from Norway.
Yes.
She did something very similar. I haven't seen her movie about jihadis, and I know that she's made a few other ones, but I saw the one White Right, where she sat down with white nationalists, and it was fascinating that at the end of that, a few of them decided that they did not want to continue down the path that they were going down. So I loved
that movie. I loved it. Yeah.
I thought it was great. I thought it was phenomenal. And the interesting thing that we need to specify is that, like, yes, like, people that dehumanize others don't deserve the dignity that we give them. Like, there's no question about that. But there is absolutely something to be said for the fact that it cures bigotry when we do.
Yeah, and there's also we have to think of I mean, if you would have asked a 15-year-old me about my views, I probably would have had some pretty disturbing racist views just because I was isolated from the rest of society and I was told that was true, right? We have to consider maybe some of these people, these neo-Nazis or whatever, some of them were presumably brought up that way.
Yeah.
And they were just never given the chance to challenge their views. And I mean, protesting, I do believe in protest. I think it is a form of free speech, right? But hitting and hating individuals, that's not going to change their view. That's just going to make them become even more steadfast in their views.
They're going to dig their heels in, yeah.
Yeah. The Dia Khan that you just mentioned, she just had a podcast interview with Sam Harris, whom I'm a massive fan of.
Yep.
What do you think of Sam?
I like him. I like him a lot. There are things that I'm sort of on the fence about that I don't know if it's even right to say that he promotes it or if it's just something that, he's a scientist, so he talked about it from a scientific perspective, like the whole thing about the IQ being related to genetics.
Right.
That's the sort of thing that I'm like, I believe in science, so it's like, I don't want to say that this is something that I agree with, but like I think my view is that like this needs more research, I think that like even if I did believe it, then I would firmly take a stance that like you can't use it for any sort of bigotry, and that like there's more to it than just saying that being of a certain race means that you're going to be less intelligent than somebody else. Like I think that so I think it's complicated.
Harris is very clear about that. And I really like a line of reasoning he made. He said, look, let's say there is no link between genetics and intelligence, but we should think there is nothing a priori to say that the universe is such that there can't be a link, right?
Mm-hmm.
The universe is a kind of place where things can happen. There might be a link. Now we have to think about our morality. Is our morality the kind of morality that would say that if there is a link, that means that we have to start gassing people, right? No,
Right.
it isn't, right? So Sam Harris says, first we have to establish our morality, regardless of what the fact is,
Mm-hmm.
and what the fact is. And our morality is very clear that no matter how people are, no matter what kind of abilities people are, we treat people with dignity, and we don't want them to suffer, and we don't want to mistreat people. Now, once we've established that, we can look into what the science has to say. But it's a completely different question from the morality.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that for me also, like, it's admittedly an emotional thing for me too. Like I can't help but, say that I struggle to accept that view. Like even if there were, so let's say hypothetically there was conclusive evidence, and and I'm not saying that this is the truth, but let's say, for example, that there's conclusive evidence that, for example, people from, I don't know, let's say like Canada are all, just inherently dumb, something like that. I would then struggle to like be in a room full of Canadians and say, hey, I know that you guys are all inherently dumb. Like that's just something that I know I would be, it would give me such anxiety. And like, I don't see myself being able to like put together an argument that would allow me to come across as not ignorant in the process of doing so. You know what I mean? Like that. And so that's why I think like I struggle to admit it, or struggle to not even admit it, but struggle to like deal with it and think about it any more than just saying like, what's even the point of delving into this even more. But it's at the same time, it's science. So it's like, I don't know what to do with this.
I think context is super important. I think of it this way. Imagine going up to a friend of yours who is genuinely overweight and maybe doesn't look the greatest. And I don't know, maybe they're trying to go into the dating scene and they're asking your advice, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, if that was the context, and this is a close friend of yours, and you genuinely meant they're good, if you told them, look, I think you can lose a little bit of weight, it might make it easier for you, it might not, but it's healthy anyway. That in itself, your friend might be grateful towards you for saying that. But in a different context, if you just went up to someone and said, well, let's just be, we care about truth, we care about facts. The fact is you're ugly and you're fat, right? Now, you've said the same thing. Both are true, but context is important. So I absolutely agree. Just telling people they're dumb or less intelligent, that's just not something we should ever say. But in some scientific matters, again, Sam Harris claims that there is no need for these statistics. He's very clear about it. He says,
yeah, he does. You're right.
There's need for them. But it's a different thing to when a scientist does make these claims and assuming their method is correct, which I don't know if it is, but assuming they've gone through the correct scientific procedure, to call them a bigot just because they've discovered something, or to denounce their findings as outright wrong just because we don't like the conclusion, that's a whole different thing. Scientific context is a different context from telling people they're dumb. It's a different thing.
Yeah, and I agree, and I think that there's value in acknowledging where he was coming from with that. I mean, it wasn't even his theory, first of all. I mean, it was that guy Charles Murray, I think is his name, when he had him on the show. Charles Murray had just done a general study about intelligence and genetics, and one aspect of that was that race was a factor, like in all of the things that were studied, and that it was worth acknowledging along with all these other things. So it's like in the book that was just one chapter, one focus. And Sam Harris is a scientist, so he didn't just say I denounce this. He said, I'm a scientist. I'm going to empirically analyze this and it'll if I come to a conclusion, it's not going to be a moral conclusion. It's just going to be, we've discovered this, and now this is something that we know. And I think that it sort of goes to what you were saying about censorship earlier. It's like by just not coming out and saying, I denounce this, then that people sort of view it as him saying, unfortunately, I'm a neo-Nazi. It's like
Yeah.
it's ridiculous, and they are very different. That's like saying that with this that I'm trying to support apostates and people who have walked away from religion, that I'm actually saying that we need to terrorize people of religion. There's a very different thing that I'm doing there. And I think what he's doing is very different from that as well. And we need to get out of this extremist view of every single thing.
Yeah, I mean, I know exactly what you mean, because every time I do an interview like this, or I write a blog and I post it somewhere, there'll be a couple of very charming dudes who will comment something extremely anti-Semitic. They'll be like, "Oh, these big hook-nosed Jews at it again," right? So they think, "Oh, it's party time. It's open season. This guy is criticizing Judaism.
Oh, what the
Ooh,
fuck?
he's on our side." And I always comment, and I'm like, "Go away. You're not with me here. I am not an anti-Semite. I am not saying Jews are these hook-nosed, money-grabbing people. I'm talking about my own experience. Go away."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's something that I was sincerely worried about, and it hit me a little bit when I started to interview ex-Muslims, and I'm sorry to keep going back to that, but it relates in that I knew that what a lot of my ex-Muslim guests were telling me was very similar to some of the things that I've heard people on what we have in the United States, the alt-right, say, that are
Right.
Associated with white nationalists and definitely associated with racism and everything like that. And then there's also the misunderstanding about what Islam is. Like, it's not a race. Like, you can't be racist against Muslims. It's not a race. It's not. It's a religion. That debate between Ben Affleck and Sam Harris on Bill Maher's show was absurd. Ben Affleck was completely in the wrong about all that. But at the same time, you look back on it and he's coming from a good place. He doesn't want Muslims who are already treated terribly in even their own countries to have it any worse. So he's coming from a good place, but he's wrong. and in doing so, he's alienating ex-Muslims. And I realized that if I was going to try to protect Islam by doing this show and try to say that, that I can't criticize Islam in the same way that I'm criticizing Christianity or Judaism or Hinduism or anything else, that I am in fact being a bigot, that I am in fact alienating my own guests. And so I needed to get away from that. And then I needed to figure out what to do with that information. And it's like, well, if I don't want to be associated with people that are racist and would use these views for racist things, it actually became kind of easy. All I realized that I had to do was say that I don't support people doing that. It's very simple. I don't support people using anything in these shows to commit atrocities, but that doesn't mean that I have any issue with criticizing the religion itself.
Yeah, there's an absurd notion nowadays that to respect someone means to validate their views. So if I'm to respect a Muslim as a person, I also have to think that the views are legitimate.
Right.
That's not the case for me. For me, these two are very, very simple. So I respect anyone, including Muslims, as people, as human beings with tremendous potential and tremendous goodness and lovely communities and everything.
Right.
And I still think that anyone who believes that Muhammad flew on a donkey, or that the Quran was written by God, or whatever it is just mistaken.
Right.
These two are not a contradiction at all to me.
Right. Right. Like if there were a house down the street that was doing the things that, or let's say there was a cult down the street, and I'm not saying that Islam is a cult. There are definitely ex-Muslims that do, but I'm just using this as an example. If there was a cult down the street that was telling people to do the things that that people who interpret the Quran correctly are telling them to do, I would have no issue saying I denounce what they're doing in that house. So for some reason, I was putting Islam on this pedestal as something that you can't criticize. And when I realized that I was doing that, I realized I was part of the problem. And that was when I started to change, and I realized that, okay, if I hold these views, what does that mean? And it was like, well, it doesn't mean that I'm a racist. Let's start with that.
Haters are always going to latch onto your beliefs. The second you say anything that they think they can use for their purpose, they're going to be there and make use of it, right? That's what I've learned from my experience. I mean, Sam Harris he is left off center. He's very clear about denouncing racism, and he's being accused of having alt-right supporters. What does that mean? It means nothing. It means that the alt-right are sometimes so desperate to find legitimacy that
Right.
they latch on to anything. It
Right.
doesn't mean anything.
Have you
Yeah.
experienced this sort of thing with Brexit?
What kind of thing?
Like people who are sort of coming out as nationalists that want it to happen, and against people that are totally for it happening. Well, you know what? Actually, I might be completely wrong about the politics of what's going on, but I could see it as sort of producing a sort of nationalism versus a liberalist or globalist perspective over there.
So it's quite messy with Brexit. So there are of course two camps, Remainers and Leavers,
Mm-hmm.
and in both camps, I think there are genuine regular folk who have their opinions, who want things to be the way they want things to be. But in both camps, you have people who do not so nice things. So, for example, of course, in the Leave camp, you do have genuine nationalists and racist or almost racist and so on. But you also have another thing that some Remainers, instead of just acknowledging that some people just want to leave for whatever reason, have a narrative that says that all leavers must be racist. It's similar to the kind of all Trump supporters are racist.
Yeah.
We have that with leavers, which is very frustrating. I'm not a leaver myself, but it really hurts me when people say that all leavers are racist. How can you say that about regular working class people who want things to change and they want to leave and whatever? And let's say they're mistaken, but why call them racist just because they don't share your idea? It really troubles me when people make these generalizations.
Yeah. I mean, the rise of nationalism is happening in a lot of different places right now, and I think that I think that throughout human history, nationalism has been either a good thing or a bad thing. And I think that just like with anything else, it has its good times and it has its bad times, and it has its reasons that can really be valuable and its reasons that can be very damaging. But what I don't like right now is that when somebody calls somebody a racist in this sort of context, that kind of just means the conversation is over. It's like as soon as somebody says you're a racist, it means that nothing else that you say matters, and I'm going to go about my day, and you can say whatever the hell you want, but it's not going to be true.
Right. Yeah, it's a conversation stopper. It's ad hominem. That's ad hominem. You're attacking the person instead of engaging with their views.
Yeah. And that's why I think it's important to be a centrist. It's like but at the same time, you don't want to become a radical centrist. You don't want to start telling people that if they don't have a centrist view, that they're wrong also. Because that can produce its own brand of radicalism. So I don't know.
Right.
You don't want to be a radical, but you also don't want to be a coward. There has to be some middle ground there, right?
Yeah, I think with political views, as with all views really, I think skepticism is the best option. Just always, you hold on to your views, but always loosely. Be ready to discard them at any moment, and always leave open some room for realizing that you're wrong and some self-doubt. I think that's a good strategy generally.
Yeah. Always have the truth as your goal, whether that means you're right or you're wrong.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Special thanks to Izzy for dedicating so much of his time to this. Because of the time difference, our conversation didn't end until after midnight on Wednesday morning for him. But he was gracious throughout. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a written review with 5 stars. The written reviews help to move the show up the charts. For immediate updates and discussions, follow the show on Twitter @OutFoldPodcast. I recently started a Patreon and GoFundMe, located at Patreon and GoFundMe.com/OutOfTheFold, because I want to be able to dedicate more time to a new approach I'm trying to take with the show. I'm not asking you to donate. Rather, just keep doing what you're doing and share the show with someone you trust. Logo and artwork by my wife. Production by my wife and I. All music by me. Tomorrow, I'll post a weekly episode with Faye and the return of Zara K. Make sure to tune in. See you on the internet. This has been Out of the Fold.